Okay, so now we can really start building our environment. What I'm going to do first is to create a bunch of locators. In this case, I'm not going to use those locators to store objects in them, but simply to use them as guidelines in our 3D space because you want to work in a real world scale as much as you can. It's just going to make your life a lot easier, and it's also going to make everything look a lot more realistic. So that's why I'm putting those different locators, like at 1 kilometer, 100 meters. Doesn't really matter what works best for you. I just know that we are dealing with like a large scale outdoor environment, so we just need to be sure that everything is physically accurate as much as possible. And it will just be easier because you know how tall a human is, and by that you can judge how your castle should look like, how tall your mountain should be, and so on. It's also quite important when it comes to the camera move. You really need to respect the real world scale if you want your parallax to look realistic. So now we can import our kitbash 3D asset. So what I've done is simply open a new session of Maya. I've opened the Maya file that comes with the kitbash 3D assets, and I'm simply copying and pasting my assets in my main 3D scene. I am unparenting them and just putting them into my kitbash 3D locator. So now I can really start to mess around with that and start to build my scene. So at this stage of the process, which I call the blockout, the only thing that really matters is just to set up basic guidelines, basic big shapes into 3D space. So it's really not about making stuff pretty at this point. The only thing we want is simply to have a guideline to see how this thing could look into 3D space, because what is different compared to like painting or rendering a still image is that in this case we have a full shot to render, so we really have to put ourselves into the skin of a real DP or photographer who is on location and somehow gotta find a way to make this shot happen, except in our case we don't have a location, everything is fake, so we have to create a location. So that's why I really like to start by blocking a very basic fake environment. So that's why I'm using those very basic shapes. Like here for the main hill on which my castle is gonna sit, I'm simply using a plane. I'm just adding divisions, enable the soft selection, and using the move tool to move the faces. And then I just move this into 3D space. I take a look at my locators. I know that this, for example, I want it to be around maybe 500 meters from the camera, from the origin at least. So I move that according to my locators. So at this point, really, don't worry about design or whatsoever. The only goal is to set up those guidelines for us. And it's also something that will be really useful for our next phase, which is going to be the matte painting bash, which I'll explain later. So I'm not even worried about the look of the castle. I just know I need a castle on a hill. So I'm just taking one of the assets from the kitbash 3D set that looks more like a full castle, and I just put it on a hill. Here I'm doing some background mountains. Same process, I just use a plane, add more divisions, I maybe delete some of the faces I think I will not need, because you always want to make sure that you keep the scene as light as possible. Then I just use the move tool with the soft selection enabled, and I just move faces to create something that is the vague idea of a mountain. And also don't worry at all about the quality of the geometry. We don't care about that at all at this stage, because all of that is going to be replaced by nicer refined assets, so we probably won't keep anything of the blockout. It's just a guide so we can start to compose our image according to the camera move, because what we need to do really is not only find a composition for the last frame, but we need to find a composition that works for every frame. So that's why it's so important to set everything in 3D as fast as possible. So here I'm creating just a second layer of mountains. Once again, I'm just duplicating what I had, moving it around a little bit. Now I'm gonna do the foreground. So my basic idea is that this hill with a castle on it would sit in the middle of like a vast plain, and this plane would be surrounded by like 360 mountains, and the camera would fly through those mountains and then arrive in the middle of this plane and reveal the castle. So I'm gonna create some kind of canyon, something like that. I'm not quite sure. It's probably just hills. I just know that they're gonna be covered by trees mostly, really tall pines. So I'm also taking that into account. I'm not making this too high, because that I know that on top of that I'm gonna scatter trees that are probably around 10 meters tall. So once again, I'm always thinking in terms of real world scale in 3D space. So I know that this phase of the process can be a little bit boring, annoying, But I think it's really important to get rid of all those technical issues as soon as possible so we can then focus on just making a really cool looking shot. But our first goal right now is really to set up a camera move with a basic composition so we can then recreate this into Nuke later, which I will explain later on. So really, don't waste too much time on this when it comes to making everything look pretty. That's not the goal. Just think in terms of placement into 3D space. I'm also going to do a bridge, probably, that's going to go through this plane right onto the castle. That really will help guide the eye, I think. And for this, as you can see, I'm just using a simple plane that I'm stretching. I don't need anything more. It's just there for me to know, okay, there's going to be a bridge there. And that would also help me to decide how I'm going to approach this shot on a technical point of view, when I'm going to do CG, when I'm going to do matte painting. And already you can see it's now much clearer already how this thing is going to look. And I can start to play with my camera, start to see what kind of camera move I want to have. So at this point, really keep on tweaking all this, move stuff around, see how the camera could fly through this until you're ready to actually animate our shot cam, which is what we're going to do next.